Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duck Bricks. I'm Chris, and I shouldn't own these LEGO items. So over the years, I've been trying to amass the largest LEGO collection in the world. And because of that, I'm trying to get as many sets as I can of the themes I like, but I'm also trying to collect the weird and obscure LEGO items. Stuff that is either related to prototypes, development, or the manufacturing or concept models from LEGO that really never sees the light of day. Of course, a lot of this part of my collection started with these prototype test bricks in different colors, and I have actually done a separate video diving deep into all of these. But what you're about to see in this video is even crazier. So join me as we take a look at some of the most bizarre, rare, and special LEGO items in my collection, many of which technically nobody is supposed to own. So let's dive in right now. Over the years, I've had the chance to collect some pretty interesting items for my LEGO collection, from original retail store displays of some of my favorite LEGO themes, to even having some prototype models originating from toy fairs, which I've covered in separate videos before, like this Axelara T9 from Bionicle featuring 3D printed pieces. My collection is home to not just standard LEGO sets, but all sorts of rare and eclectic items, and I wanted to put out this video to highlight a couple of items that are just super special to me, and some items that I just haven't really talked about on video before. Of course, there are different thresholds of rarity here, so what do I mean by I can't own these? Well, there are some items I do own that come from, say, designer exclusive conferences, like the Cosmic Daydream set featuring the Purple Spaceman, or some of these LEGO brand retail manager conference exclusive sets and minifigures, but I'm talking about a level even beyond these. These items that I'm going to talk about in this video today are items that could be even one of a kind, maybe only a couple exist in the world, and almost all of them are related to either prototypes or sets that were cancelled or development material from LEGO. I'm going to start off with some of these bricks here. Of course, when LEGO was initially making tests for their plastic, or when they switch out one plastic mold to another color, they tend to produce some marbled bricks, which you can see here, and as you can probably imagine, these are pretty hard to come by. It's a lot more special to have more than 3 or 4 colors in the same brick, especially because typically this happens when LEGO changes from one color to another, so if you have a mix of a ton of different colors in there, it gets even crazier and more expensive and rare. This single brick right here cost me several $100s, and I like to affectionately call it the lava brick because it kind of has this like black and red and yellow kind of molten color to it, which I really love. But one brick that's even more special is this piece right here. If you recall, back in the day, LEGO was experimenting with making plant-based bricks, and while unfortunately those experiments never really panned out, this is a prototype Duplo brick that actually says patent pending. You can see it barely embossed on there. It doesn't really show up great on camera, but it actually is made from a plant-based material. On the underside, you can actually see why these experiments didn't actually work out. Despite the fact that the outside of the brick seems perfectly normal, the underside is already experiencing some wear and tear, and you can clearly tell that the material just didn't quite hold up to LEGO standards. So unfortunately, despite all their tests, they decided not to produce these. Moving onwards to other prototype material, Bionicle is another big focus of my collection, and there's a couple of standout Bionicle masks I want to talk about. The white Huna, brown Komau, and medium blue Kakama are all super special, as well as this medium blue Trident, which originated from Bionicle co-creator Christian Faber's private collection. This was a piece that was initially released in blue, but it never was made in medium blue. That was just a prototype color. And the same goes for the colors of these 3 masks here, where they initially were trying to come up with even more different colors for the Kanohi masks, which for whatever reason were just never really produced. And because really the only way to get those masks are having them escape from the factory, I had to pay several $1,000s per mask. To date, I believe only 2 to 3 copies of each of these masks have ever been found, making them some of the rarest items in my collection. And that's not even counting some of the other European quote-unquote misprint masks which made their way into a couple of early mask packs, like these multicolored Matatus and Rurus, or the extremely rare silver Kanohi Nuva, all of which command hundreds of dollars each on the aftermarket. Plus, when LEGO changed the color of plastic to pearl gold from flat dark gold, a couple of 2005 system sets were made with that color, making those pearl gold pieces very rare as well. But those are really just additional items on the list, and really, the most special items were the ones I showcased from the factory there. On the topic of Bionicle, back in 2003, LEGO held a campaign where they randomly included a couple of white metal as well as sterling silver chronicles in sets. But obviously, since you could get those in regular retail sets, I'm not even counting that on this list. The really special item is the prototype item. Made from vacuum metal here, this was an early test for LEGO trying to cast these pieces in metal, which never was released to the public outside of being given away to a few select fans at conventions, as well as just kind of making its way out there in the world, which is how I obtained this one. And for one last Bionicle mask prototype, I have a pearl gold copy of the Kanohi Evoki, the Mask of Light. If you're wondering how exactly this was made and what the origin of it is actually one of the strangest pieces in my collection, because this was actually made for a prototype toothbrush. LEGO partnered with Colgate Toothbrush back in the day to produce LEGO Bionicle branded toothbrushes, and this was one specific test. They never released a Takanuva Toa of Light toothbrush, but they made at least a couple of prototypes where they cast the mask in pearl gold. The mold is actually a little bit different than the regular piece used by LEGO. There are some minute differences, especially when you take a look at the back of the piece itself, so it isn't even necessarily an official LEGO piece made by that same mold. It's just one made by Colgate after LEGO gave them the dimensions of the piece to produce it for their toothbrushes, and you can see the specific differences here. It's a fascinating piece of Bionicle history, and one that will set you back several $1,000s. But we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg here, where obviously, as we move away from Bionicle, there's a ton of other fascinating LEGO items, mostly prototype elements, that can be seen in my collection. When I visited Christian Faber's private offices in Copenhagen, Denmark, he was able to show me a ton of really interesting development material from co-creating a ton of classic LEGO themes. Star Wars, Minecraft, Friends, Galaxy Squad, you name it, and he even had some prototypes that he gave me for my own private museum. You can see here some prototype minifigures from Ultra Agents and Galaxy Squad, including an unprinted Galaxy Squad robot, but the most interesting thing to me is the completely unprinted quote-unquote naked Friends mini doll, which to me is one of the funniest items I was able to pick up to add to my collection because it is just so bizarre in how it was made. It clearly is just supposed to be a prototype, and it's just a very interesting piece. Speaking of LEGO Friends, a special golden mini doll was given away only to core members of the LEGO Friends team to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the theme, and I also got a couple of prototype stickered elements from the LEGO Masters World Wonderliner Travel Moment set, which I actually was able to get as part of the development process of making that LEGO set a reality, which I now have proudly displayed as a really nice keepsake in my collection. And on the topic of prototype stickered elements, this is a prototype LEGO Minecraft sheep. This piece originated from Christian Faber's collection because he was instrumental in developing LEGO Minecraft, and it's really interesting seeing the early direction of what a more standard traditional brick-built sheep would have looked like before LEGO decided to make an exclusive new mold specifically for animals for Minecraft. It's a cool look at what could have been, and obviously they probably were going to have eventually printed that front face like they did in the final set, but I do definitely think it's a really cool iteration process where it really shows how LEGO was developing it. And then we get to one of the most interesting items in my collection. This is the Ezra Miller Flash minifigure, which originates from the cancelled Batmobile Flash tracking set, which initially was supposed to come out for the Flash movie featuring the Michael Keaton Batman as well as the Sasha Kai Supergirl, but eventually was never actually released to the public, and instead the Batmobile from that set was rebranded as a Michael Keaton Batman set instead, which I think was a lot less interesting, but it definitely makes sense as to why LEGO canceled the set, especially given the controversy surrounding Ezra Miller as an actor, and also just the very troubled release of that movie in general. However, a few copies were produced, and by a few I literally mean like 2 or 3 that I know of are out there in the world, and if you're curious as to how I obtained this, the answer is I honestly don't really know. A seller randomly reached out to me on Facebook who had the torso and the head, and I was able to verify they were legit, and then a different seller reached out to me who had the helmet. So I actually had to kinda piecemeal this one together, and that's why my copy is missing the exclusive printed legs. This figure was fully decked out, and it was initially supposed to come with printed legs, but I just haven't ever been approached by a seller who had them for sale, so I never got the legs. But hey, if you happen to be one of the probably 2 or 3 people in the world who own the legs and want to sell them, please do reach out to me and let me know. Of course, the minifigure itself has some pretty remarkable detail, and it's so cool seeing what could have been for this figure. It's utilizing the Captain America helmet in red with the Flash wings printed on the side, and he has kind of a scared or upset face as well as a happy face, which I actually think fit the character very well. And it's really cool to see the amount of detail on the torso print itself, really trying to capture the little lines and details that made the suit very unique and stand out in the movie. Altogether, this is one of the rarest items in my collection, and it's so cool to actually have him displayed next to the other iterations of the Flash from all different types of DC media. I love the Flash as a character in the comics, so this was absolutely the figure for me. But on the topic of other minifigure components that were supposed to come out but cancelled last minute, we have some specialized molds from the wave of Video that never came to be. Video was a pretty ill-fated LEGO theme that only had a couple of CMF series and a few sets, but it was actually supposed to expand out to a ton of different other topics until they prematurely canceled the theme. Some of the figures you see here include a Viking with headphones on, a witch hat, which thankfully they did manage to use that mold again for some other sets, and a whole dinosaur faction, featuring a lime green Triceratops with purple headphones and a Brachiosaurus rocking a backwards baseball cap. Bro thinks he's Chris Doc Wyatt with that fit. Altogether, these are some of the most interesting pieces in my collection because obviously they were supposed to go alongside some previously unreleased LEGO Video minifigures. While some of the pieces shown here did eventually get released in some other LEGO sets in different colors, like the witch hat appearing in the Hocus Pocus set as well as a couple of other witch-themed LEGO minifigures, most of these other pieces never actually made their way into eventually being produced because they were so specific to LEGO Video. I think my favorite of them is probably the dinosaur Triceratops head. I just think it is a really cool mold, and also just having those headphones molded in and the big grin just adds so much character to it, but it also is really cool to see that dual molded witch hat as well. And I'm really glad LEGO eventually decided to release it in different colors for D&D as well as Hocus Pocus. The Viking helmet is probably one of the least useful ones out of all of them because the headphones are literally molded in, but personally I'd love to see a LEGO Viking helmet that is kind of shaped like this, maybe even with that same style of printing, but just without the headphones. I think it is genuinely a really cool graphic design, and I'm kind of sad we missed out on whatever that Vikings theme would have looked like for Video. The witch hat here is using satin opalescent transparent blue hair, which is super cool and definitely one of the most interesting hair colors that they could have done for a piece like this. And the witch hat itself is pretty standard in black, and then of course you have the dinosaur heads themselves. Of course, no other pieces of these minifigures have surfaced. We know from leaked game files that the Jetpack Racer from the latest original series of collectible minifigures was originally produced for Video in a completely different color scheme, but later repurposed just recently for that CMF, so who knows, maybe we will eventually see LEGO use these molds again. I could totally see them doing a collectible minifigure with that Brachiosaurus head in a different color, so maybe time will tell if we'll ever see these eventually make their way onto store shelves. Moving onwards, there's a couple of other strange items in my collection, like these monochrome or fully transparent Darth Vader minifigures. All of these are made by factory employees who LEGO technically doesn't even recognize these as official LEGO products because they are literally just made by factory employees messing around and trying to make some money on eBay, but I picked up a few for the novelty of it, and they are made with official LEGO plastic using official LEGO molds at the LEGO factory, so in my books, they at least count as LEGO items to me. What's far more interesting though is this prototype block. I don't really have any other words to describe this. Now, since I actually picked this up, I've had a few people DM me photos of the box this came in, which was a test box to showcase LEGO Motion. I don't really know how this was distributed. A few LEGO employees have told me that they've seen this like sitting around their offices, so maybe this is like internally circulated, a couple made it out. I really don't know. The way I got it was I found it at a used LEGO store. I was at a used LEGO store in Germany, and it literally was just for sale. I thought it was very strange, and they didn't really have that much information about it either, so of course I had to pick it up for my own collection. So how exactly does this work? Well, this is a block meant to demonstrate the kind of motion that you can achieve throughout just one single LEGO piece. There is a string that you can pull out of one end, and there's a switch to flip. So the switch locks it in place, and when you flip it one way, the top part spins, as well as the middle section here, which actually holds an axle frictionlessly, which allows it to slide in and out. It's a very strange item, and it literally is marked prototype on the side. It's kind of embossed on the side of the brick, which I've rarely actually seen LEGO do. All in all, it's a really interesting piece, and I'm very curious to see if LEGO sets will start including more motion items like this. It is really cool to have a function where you pull a string, it sucks a string up, you can flip a switch to actually stop it in its tracks, and also turn an axle at the same time. I would love to break this open and see what the interior looks like, but I am absolutely not going to damage like the one copy of this I have. That being said, I've had enough people message me on Instagram asking if I want to buy this that I imagine that there are at least quite a few different copies out there in the wild. It just really isn't necessarily something that you see every day, and you can see the motion demonstrated here. Flipping the switch causes it to stop, and then you can pull it again. The very fact that it's labeled prototype, and this may sound counterintuitive, but it makes me believe that this might have been distributed or at least used in some sort of workshop where maybe non-LEGO employees got their hands on it, because it is really weird for it to literally be called prototype. Internally, LEGO never really labels things as prototype because it's kind of understood that you're dealing with prototypes when you're developing something internally within LEGO, so it's just a very strange piece to me. It clearly is LEGO. All of the items I'm showing in this video are verifiably directly from LEGO itself, so it absolutely is a real item, just certainly not something you see every day. Altogether, I love playing around with this. I would love to integrate it into some sort of a mock. I'm not really sure what I would do, maybe some sort of like pull activated motion box or something like that, but if I ever have the time, I would love to like build this into something and really just take full advantage of the mechanism it provides. But speaking of LEGO prototypes, there are a couple of other very interesting prototype items that I wanted to showcase on this list, and we're gonna start off with these two minifigures right here. As we all know, the print details on LEGO minifigures are incredibly precise, and in order to achieve this, LEGO has a test print alignment that they apply to a couple of different minifigures every time they try out a new machine in the factory that's ready to go ahead and print decals on minifigures. The one I'm holding right now is super special because it's actually featuring dual molded pieces, which are in all sorts of different colors. Very cool to see that actually being used on a test print minifigure, and you can see there, this is how they test the alignment to make sure that their alignment is 100% accurate. So every time they're printing details on LEGO minifigures, this makes sure the machine is working properly and doesn't necessarily mess up the print or have something off to the side, which sometimes happens, and there's a whole other segment of LEGO collecting for misprints, but of course that's a whole different story. Speaking of misprints, these are slightly misprinted LEGO NASA Saturn V rocket lunar lander minifigures. These ones are missing some of the printing on the microfigures here, and I just thought those were interesting, so I picked them up. Of course, on the subject of prototypes, I do actually own a few different Bionicle prototypes. This prototype Pohatu is one of the rarest items in my collection, which I paid several $1,000s for. You can see that the pieces are actually machined using special machinery to actually prototype test the pieces, which is why the mold marks are very visible on like the bottom of the foot here. It also has a sticker which can be seen on the shoe of many prototype figures and models. They stick those on, determining that they are prototypes. And, of course, another big giveaway that these are prototypes, like the Onua here from Bionicle, is the code on the outside of the masks. The final versions had the code on the inside, but the prototype versions had the code on the outside, and the Onua is actually from Christian Faber's collection. I also managed to obtain a Liwa Nuva prototype on eBay. I have no idea where this originates from, but you can see the actual development process used to actually test out the new elements, specifically these silver pieces there, which is super cool. And then of course that classic prototype sticker where you can actually see the designers who were working on it, which is super cool how that's actually hand signed and drawn on the piece. Lastly, we wrap up with Kopaka here, who is a prototype. You can tell by the layering and lines on the mask, but unfortunately there is no code on the outside of this one's mask, so it isn't as obviously a prototype as some others, but it still is very clearly part of the same family. For me, I always love seeing the different prototype elements, especially the process that goes into making a prototype LEGO piece, where you can clearly see the way this was developed. It was eventually spray painted silver but developed in white, almost using a very similar 3D printing method as Shapeways does for some of their custom printed pieces, which is very, very cool to actually have in hand for all those parts. Also, beyond that, there are a couple of items that are a little bit less rare, and it is a little bit strange to describe items as less rare when I'm talking about unreleased items here, but of course, we do have the Osprey, and I think I did a video on this like 4 or 5 years ago when I got it, so honestly, don't want to spend too much time on this one because a ton of other people have covered it already on YouTube, and essentially, a couple of these made it out onto certain markets. I think I got mine from Russia, actually, back in 2021, I want to say, or 2020, so whenever this set was releasing, that was when I got my copy. And the same goes for this cancelled GWP of Santa's Workshop. A lot of people were wondering why LEGO cancelled this GWP, and I actually did a whole separate video on this particular item, which you can check out, but the leading theory is that this set features a naughty list, which maybe, I guess, LEGO decided it wasn't appropriate to have some kids depicted on the naughty list, especially if you see your name there. That's not a very fun piece to include, but my theory is that the first name on the naughty list suspiciously looks like it says Donald, and obviously, there's only one Donald who's very popular and famous who might appear on the top of a naughty list, and LEGO might have figured that that was a little bit too dicey to actually include in an official LEGO set. So it is what it is. That being said, despite this set being cancelled, a surprisingly high amount of them somehow made their way to the aftermarket. I believe there's a couple on like eBay right now, and I actually got mine at a LEGO convention. Moving on from that, there is one final item on this list that I really want to emphasize, and this item is maybe one of the most interesting of the bunch. I found this item at a used LEGO store in Germany. The box is 100% empty, but this is a prototype retail box for the LEGO Ninjago Sons of Garmadon Street Race of the Snake Jaguar set. If you're curious about the story behind something like this, LEGO will send prototype boxes out to retailers so they can allocate shelf space for new LEGO products. This one in particular was probably sent to a retailer like Sears, which is where most of these prototype boxes come from. I've seen a couple pop up online in certain circles, like a Marvel Infinity War one, for instance, which appeared on Facebook, but this one was super exciting to me because obviously it is Ninjago themed, and you can see the prototype development of making this set alongside the box itself. Obviously, there's a couple of things like Canadian product name or Mexico product name, which are just placeholders on the box, which is super cool. No barcode, and it says item is preliminary, but the most interesting thing to me is the artwork on the side of the box, where you can see all sorts of different development versions of the characters, like Mr. E's Mask of Vengeance being fully plain on this side, and then on the other side it's actually using the print for the Mask of Hatred, so it's cool seeing the development process there. Even the extra arm piece for Mr. E has a completely different print, and honestly, I prefer the final version a lot to the original print here, which is super basic and not that interesting. It's pretty interesting also seeing the katana headpiece from LEGO DC being used there, clearly as a placeholder, but it actually is kind of Ninjago-y in its design, so I can see why they specifically chose that one to use as the placeholder. And then finally, the most interesting piece to me is a look at a prototype Nia minifigure on the side of the box, which is kind of a blend between the classic designs and the Ninjago movie designs. We never got the Ninjago movie half mask in the dark red and azure color, and I feel like this would have been such a cool minifigure to get. I'm kind of sad we didn't get Nia in those classic colors here, and clearly they did consider it before deciding to go with the Ninjago movie silver. Altogether, this is just a quick look at some of the many unique rare items in my collection that technically nobody is supposed to own because they don't even necessarily officially exist. Of course, we're barely scratching the surface when it comes to my collection and extremely random rare items I've picked up over the years, and I'm really glad to have been able to showcase these on YouTube, mostly to document some of these items. I know that images for most of the stuff I've shown here are online. I would say 99.9% of these actually have been photographed online, but I really wanted to showcase them in a video and really just be able to share with the community some of these really interesting development LEGO pieces. Obviously, this is just the beginning. I have probably enough of these items where I can make a second version of this video and still not have covered all of the crazy items in my collection, like an original copy of the Voodoo doll from the cancelled LEGO Indiana Jones Temple of Doom set, which I just randomly got in my collection, and so much more. So, If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stuff like it, please do let me know in the comments, and of course, let me know if you do happen to own any of these items yourselves. You might be some of the rare lucky few who actually have these special items, and I'd love to hear what rare items do you own, or would you like to see me cover on this channel. That's all for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon, and bye for now.